fourth plate stopped him. Elias Croom had his hands in the sodium thiosulfate bath, tilting the glass at the slow, practiced angle he always used. Careful, no wasted motion. When the image resolved fully and something in it made the air go thin. Not the bodies. He had processed photographs of the dead for 3 years. The shock of that had been worn away sometime in the winter of 1862. The way stone is worn smooth by water that never stops moving. What stopped him now was a shadow. A single shadow at the upper left corner of the frame, falling at an angle geometrically impossible for midday August light in Southern Virginia. The shadow said one thing. The sky behind the tree line said something entirely different. He stood with the plate lifted to the amber lamp, the chemical tray dripping below his hands, and understood that the scene in front of him had not been photographed. It had been arranged. He set the plate in the drying rack. He said nothing. Outside, Pennsylvania Avenue moved with its usual noise. Wagon wheels on cobblestone. A vendor calling from the direction of the Treasury. A horse protesting somewhere down the block in the August heat. It was 1864. Somewhere 130 miles south of where Elias was standing, General Grant was in the 7th week of siege operations around Petersburg, Virginia. More than 4,000 men had died along that front since June. The line had barely moved 12 miles. The newspapers needed images. The public demanded images. And the only man in Washington, D.C., who had just noticed something wrong with one of them went back to work and made a small mark in his notebook. That mark was the beginning of everything. His full name was Elias Marcus Croom, and he had been born in Philadelphia in 1835, the second child of Marcus and Hannah Croom, both free persons of color, both possessed of a wariness about the world that had never, in 30 years of living inside it, been given cause to relax. Marcus Croom worked for 3 separate abolitionist newspapers over the course of 2 decades. He set type. He pulled proofs. He cleaned rollers at the end of shifts that ran past midnight. And in the hours between, he taught his son to read not just words, but the mechanical structure of images, because Marcus Croom believed, with the particular conviction of a man who had spent his life making images for other people, that a lie in print always had a physical signature. A misaligned type block cast a specific shadow in the pressed impression. A doctored photographic plate showed a density inconsistency at its altered edge. The truth, he told Elias repeatedly, was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of measurement. Elias was 12 years old when his father's shop on Chestnut Street was destroyed. It was the winter of 1847. A mob came on a Tuesday evening, overturned the press, smashed the type cases, and burned 3 of Marcus Croom's 5 years of preserved newspaper archive in the middle of the street. The fire burned for 2 hours. No charges were ever filed. The family moved twice in the following 8 months and rebuilt quietly, the way people who have no other choice rebuild, without announcement, without drama, with the focused silence of people who understand that survival is its own argument. Marcus Croom spent the final 11 years of his working life as a drafting assistant at a map-making firm near the Delaware waterfront. He never spoke publicly again, but he spoke privately, late into evenings at the kitchen table, always to Elias. "Images are the only testimony a court cannot suppress," he said once, pressing a proof sheet flat with his palm. "Words can be called lies. Numbers can be called mistakes. But light on silver, that's a different kind of witness. Elias carried that sentence the way other men carry a tool they never put down. By the time he was 17, he could develop a calotype print from exposure to dry state without supervision, calibrate a lens aperture by eye under direct sunlight, and identify a composite double exposure from the gradient inconsistency alone, a skill he discovered he had when he noticed it in a daguerreotype portrait displayed in a shop window on Market Street, the way some people notice a false note in music without being able to name the key. He apprenticed for 2 years at a portrait studio on Walnut Street, owned by a cautious German immigrant named Friedrich Brauer. Brauer paid him half of what the white apprentices made and trusted him twice as much with the chemistry. The work was not dramatic. Pension portraits, business headshots, the occasional daguerreotype restoration. But it was precise, chemical, and unforgiving of carelessness. Elias Croom learned precision the way blacksmiths learn fire, through daily contact with something that punished inattention immediately and without appeal. When the war began in April 1861, Elias was 26 years old and knew exactly what was about to happen to the American press. He followed the momentum south to Washington, where every journalist, illustrator, and photographer in the northern states was converging on a city that had become the nerve center of the military news apparatus. He found work within 18 days. The shop was owned by a former portrait photographer from Columbus, Ohio, named Harlan Greer, a careful, soft-spoken man who had secured press processing contracts with 2 illustrated weeklies and a wire service, and occupied 4 rooms on the second floor of a brick building 2 blocks from the Treasury. The rooms smelled always of ether, silver, and the particular sweet, chemical heaviness of collodion drying on glass. 6 people worked there. Elias worked the development room. He processed every plate that came through the door. In the first 30 months of the contract, Greer's shop handled approximately 1,400 individual glass plate negatives. Photographers working the Virginia, Maryland, and Tennessee theaters, images moving from battlefield wagons to Washington processing rooms, to engraving houses, to the pages of newspapers that were read in parlors from Boston to Cincinnati. Elias developed each plate personally. He logged chemical ratios to the quarter minute. He noted when a collodion coating was beginning to strip at the edge of a glass. He filed everything. He read every image before it went into the archive. He was not paid to do this. It was simply who he was. By August of 1864, without any title or formal recognition, Elias Croom had become the most experienced battlefield photograph analyst in a city full of them. He was also completely invisible. That combination would become the most important fact of the next 4 months. The photographer named Garfield Holt had submitted work to Greer's shop on 3 previous occasions over the 18 months before August 1864. His plates were technically excellent, well-exposed, minimal coating defects, compositions that editors described as simultaneously professional and emotionally immediate. He had War Department press credentials issued in March 1863. In the offices of Harper's Weekly and the New York Illustrated News, he was considered reliable, productive, and commercially valuable. He had documented the aftermath of 4 engagements along the Virginia front. His specialty was the dead. He understood, as all serious war photographers understood, that wet plate collodion technology required 5 to 30 seconds of exposure time, long enough for the living to blur into nothing, long enough for the dead to hold perfectly still. Elias Croom had never met Holt. He knew him only through his plates. The August delivery arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a young assistant in a padded wooden case. 11 plates, each wrapped in black cloth, labeled in Holt's careful ink script on paper slips tucked into each fold. Weldon Railroad, August 19th, 1864. Skirmish aftermath. Southern Virginia. Standard documentation. Elias signed for the case, carried it to the development room, and began working through the batch one plate at a time. By the third plate, one anomaly. By the sixth, another. By the time he set the 11th plate in the drying rack, he had 4 marks in his notebook. The small cloth-bound book he kept in the interior pocket of his work apron, normally used for chemical ratios and timing logs. The first mark, plate 4, shadow angle inconsistent with solar position implied by sky luminosity, estimated time differential minimum 3 hours. The second, plate 7, wool infantry cap, split crown pattern, lower right quadrant. Same cap pattern appears on a different subject, plate 9. The third, plate 9, ground moisture indicates rain within 6 to 8 hours prior. August 19th, dispatch records show no precipitation in Weldon sector for 11 days. The fourth, plate 11, tree line, shadow length, indicates 4 to 5 p.m. light. Caption states, morning aftermath, before 9 a.m. He read them. He closed the notebook. He put it in his apron pocket and walked to Greer's office filing cabinet, where a weekly weather telegraph log from the War Department sat in a labeled manila folder, a routine document used to correlate outdoor photography dates with regional weather conditions. He found the week of August 15th to 22nd, 1864. He read it standing at the cabinet, one hand on the drawer. No precipitation in the Weldon Railroad sector for the 11 days between August 8th and August 19th. The ground in plate 9 was wet. He put the log back in the cabinet. He told no one. He was not yet certain he had anything worth telling. Anomalies existed inside innocent explanations. Plates were mislabeled under battlefield conditions. Captions were written from memory. He was his father's son. He knew the difference between evidence and conclusion. He waited for the second delivery with the patience of a man who had learned very early that certainty was something you built one measurement at a time. The second batch arrived 14 days later, on a Thursday morning in the first week of September. 15 plates in 2 cases, covering 3 separate engagement sites. Operations near the Appomattox River, a supply depot fire near Sutherland Station, and terrain labeled Reserve Position, 3rd Corps Sector. 48 hours after that delivery, Elias had his answer. He found it in plate 16. He almost missed it. The plate showed a wide field view, bodies arranged across the middle ground, a broken artillery limber in the right foreground, a tree line fading into overexposed sky at the upper left. The composition was deliberate, too deliberate, the kind of framing that required time and positioning, not the rushed, handheld work of a man photographing a fresh battlefield before the light changed. What pulled his eye was the artillery limber's right wheel. One spoke was shattered and fanned outward in 9 distinct fragments, a specific, unrepeatable pattern, the kind of damage that produced a unique physical signature, the way a broken bone heals in its own particular configuration. He had seen that wheel before. He went to the filing cabinet. He pulled the sleeves from Holt's 3 previous batch deliveries and found it in a plate submitted 14 months earlier, labeled Cold Harbor Sector, June 1864. The same limber, the same 9-fragment spoke, the same camera angle relative to the wheel's position. Cold Harbor was 38 miles from Sutherland Station. He stood at the filing cabinet for a long time. He was 31 years old and had spent the last 3 years developing images of a war that killed men at a rate of 300 per day along some sectors of the Virginia front. He understood what he was looking at. A broken artillery limber does not travel 38 miles between engagements and arrive in the same condition, at the same angle, in a photograph taken 14 months later. It does not do this because broken artillery is stripped for parts or left where it fell. What it can do, under one specific circumstance, is serve as a prop, something a photographer with a wagon, an assistant, and access to the correct terrain could haul into position on an open field and arrange among bodies he had sourced from any number of actual battlefield sites where the dead lay in sufficient quantity. The bodies may have been real. The dead were real enough. The war produced them without shortage. What was not real was the context, the time, the location, the specific engagement, the story the image was claiming to document. He had 26 plates, the 11 from the first batch, the 15 from the second. He had 32 separate anomalies, geometric and meteorological and physical, distributed across those 26 plates. He had a weather log contradiction. He had a duplicated prop on 2 battlefields 38 miles apart. He had a man whose celebrated career had been built on photographs the public could not verify, and editors had no time to question. He opened his notebook to a clean page. He picked up his pencil. He began to write, and he did not stop for 11 nights. He worked after the shop closed, staying past dark under the pretext of chemical inventory, a task Greer had assigned him 4 months earlier and promptly forgotten. Each night he pulled 1 or 2 of Holt's plates from the archive, held them under the amber lamp, and added findings to the notebook. 47 pages by the end of the 11th night. 32 photographic anomalies, cross-referenced by plate number, location label, and claimed date. A full reconstruction of solar angles for each claimed location, calculated against published almanac tables and compared to shadow geometry in the images. 4 separate instances of prop duplication. The artillery limber, a distinctive splice pattern in a length of field rope, a split crown knapsack model that appeared on 3 different bodies in 3 different locations, and a fence post section with a specific bark-stripped upper end that appeared in images labeled as 3 separate engagement sites across 2 counties. The notebook was now the most dangerous object in the building. He knew this. It felt different in his coat pocket, heavier somehow than 47 pages of cloth-bound paper had any right to feel. He wrapped it in oilcloth from the supply room. He carried it home inside his coat every night. He did not attempt to copy. Copying required another person's eyes, and he was not ready for that, not yet. He had the evidence. What he did not have was a path forward, any path, to someone with the authority and the willingness to act on what 47 pages of a black man's handwriting contained. He wrote it on the last page of the notebook, in a single sentence, the last thing he added before he closed it for the night. The difficulty is not the evidence. The difficulty is the audience. He tried 3 times before the end of 1864. The first attempt was the most direct. He asked Harlan Greer for a meeting and laid out 3 of the clearest anomalies: the shadow geometry from plate 4, the matching artillery limber, and the weather log, using the plates themselves to demonstrate. He was controlled. He did not raise his voice. He had planned the sequence of presentation for 2 days in advance. Greer listened for approximately 8 minutes. Then he thanked Elias for his thoroughness, described the anomalies as probable mislabeling errors common under battlefield conditions, and said he would send a note of inquiry to Holt's office. The note was never sent. Elias confirmed this 6 weeks later by checking the shop's outgoing correspondence file, which Greer kept in a labeled folder in the bottom drawer of his desk. The folder contained 14 letters. None were addressed to Holt. The second attempt came in November. Elias learned that a War Department civilian clerk named Aldrich made weekly visits to the shop to collect archive materials for government records. Aldrich was pale, efficient, precise in his documentation. The kind of government man who believed in procedure because procedure was safer than judgment. Elias approached him in the filing room on a Wednesday afternoon and asked whether the War Department maintained any process for reviewing photographic documentation for factual accuracy. Aldrich looked at him with a particular expression of a man who has been asked a question that falls outside the columns of his ledger. He said that the department's photographic archive was maintained for historical preservation, not verification. The accuracy of captions, he said, is the photographer's responsibility. He then collected his copies and left. The third attempt never became an attempt. Elias had identified a journalist in Philadelphia named Percival Oakes, who wrote a weekly column for a reform-minded paper and had published 2 pieces critical of the press corps' access arrangements in Virginia. He wrote Oakes a 7-page letter, careful, specific, evidenced, with 3 hand-drawn diagrams of the shadow angle analysis enclosed. He addressed the envelope. He sealed it. Then he held it for 9 days, turning it over in his hands each evening the way a man turns over a decision he already knows the answer to. On the 9th day, he burned it at the fireplace grate in his room, feeding it in corner first, watching the wax seal blacken. He had understood, finally and completely, what would happen to that letter when it arrived. It would not be received as evidence. It would be received as an accusation. And the nature of the accusation, from a black processing room worker against a white photographer with congressional admirers and gallery exhibitions in Boston, would be presumed before anyone unfolded the diagrams. He had the truth. He had no door that would open for it. Then on a cold morning in early December, Harlan Greer came into the development room with an expression Elias had not seen on him before. Not anger, not concern, something quieter and more specific. The expression of a man delivering information he does not want to be responsible for having. He said Garfield Holt had been in the shop the previous evening after hours. He had asked to review the processing records for his recent submissions, and he had asked with what Greer described as casual interest whether anyone on the staff had been studying the plates beyond routine processing requirements. Elias said nothing. The sodium thiosulfate dripped in the tray. A cab passed on the street below. Greer studied him for a moment. Then he said, "Elias, whatever you think you found, I want you to understand what kind of man Holt is. He has a meeting with the editorial board of Harper's next month. He has a senator who collects his prints. He has been to the White House on 2 occasions. He paused. The amber lamp hummed. And you work in a darkroom on Pennsylvania Avenue. That night, Elias sat at his table in the cold of his room on G Street with the notebook open in front of him. He read every page, his 32 anomalies, his 47 pages, his 4 instances of prop duplication. He read the last sentence. The difficulty is not the evidence. The difficulty is the audience. Then he opened the inside back cover where he had glued. Weeks before, as a precaution he could not then fully explain to himself, a single contact print from plate 16. The artillery limber. The 9 fragments spoke. The prop that had been in Cold Harbor in June 1864 and in Sutherland Station, 38 miles away, 14 months later. The print was the size of a playing card. It was the only physical duplicate of any part of his investigation that existed outside his own handwriting. He wrapped the notebook back in its oilcloth. He placed it inside the broken camera case in the corner of his room. A case with a sprung latch that had not properly closed in 2 years. A piece of equipment so visibly useless that no one who entered the room had ever shown any interest in it. He pressed the lid down as far as it would go. He went to his window. December in Washington. The street below was empty. The gas lamps haloed in cold fog, the cobblestones glazed with the kind of thin ice that forms before anyone notices. He could see 3 blocks south, the faint silhouette of the Treasury building, and somewhere above it, the black sky that ran. If you followed it south for 130 miles to Petersburg, Virginia, where men had been dying in the mud since the spring, Holt knew that someone at the shop had been looking. He had perhaps 72 hours before that knowledge became specific, before the question changed from whether someone had been studying his plates to who. He needed a different kind of witness, someone outside the press contract, outside the government archive, outside every institution that had already decided it had no interest in what 47 pages of careful observation might contain. He did not yet know where to find one, but he knew what he was going to have to do to survive the next 3 days. He arrived at the shop at 7 in the morning and Garfield Holt was already there. Elias saw him from the bottom of the stairwell. A large man, broader than he had imagined from the handwriting on the plate labels, standing in the outer office with one hand resting on the filing cabinet near Greer's desk. He wore a brown wool overcoat, unbuttoned, and a soft crown hat he had not removed, which meant he did not intend to stay. He was speaking to Greer in the low, comfortable register of a man accustomed to taking up room in spaces that did not belong to him. He was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of unhurried confidence that accumulates in men who have been admired long enough that admiration starts to feel like gravity, simply the direction things fall. He stopped talking when Elias came through the door. The look lasted 3 seconds. It did not move his face. It did something decisive behind his eyes. Then Holt turned back to Greer and continued speaking, and Elias walked to the development room and tied on his apron and put both hands into the chemical tray and stood there in the amber-lit silence that smelled of ether and silver nitrate and told himself to breathe at a measured rate. His hands were steady. He made sure of that. He had seen enough in those 3 seconds to understand. Holt was not there about the processing records. He was there about him. 2 hours passed. Elias worked through the morning batch. 17 plates from 2 photographers covering supply routes and camp structures. Routine documentation that required nothing from him except the mechanics of the process. He developed them in order, he fixed them, he filed them. He did not look up when he heard Greer's office door open, did not look up when footsteps crossed the outer room, did not look up when those footsteps paused at the entrance to the development room for 4 or 5 seconds, and then moved away. He looked up only when Greer appeared in the doorway at 9:30, holding nothing, standing with his weight slightly back, the posture of a man delivering a message he has not entirely decided to deliver. "Holt wants a word," Greer said. He did not look at Elias directly when he said it. About what? About his work. The processing timeline on his submissions. Standard inquiry. There was nothing standard about it. They both knew it. Elias dried his hands on the cloth at the tray rail and followed Greer into the outer office, where Holt had positioned himself near the window overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue. The December light came in flat and cold behind him, at his back, which meant his face was in shadow while Elias's was in full light. A photographer's instinct. Holt had spent 20 years deciding exactly where to stand. "You're the man who processes my plates," Holt said. "I process all the plates that come through this shop. I've heard you're thorough." "I try to be." Holt nodded slowly, as if Elias had confirmed something he had already measured and found exactly where he expected it. He asked in a tone of complete reasonableness whether there had been any technical difficulties with his 2 most recent batches, coding failures, fixing irregularities, anything requiring extended handling time beyond normal procedure. Elias said there had not. Holt asked whether the plates had been re-examined after initial filing. Elias said re-examination sometimes occurred as part of quality assessment. Holt asked who authorized quality reviews. Elias said Greer authorized them. Greer, standing to the left of the desk, said nothing. His hands were at his sides and very still. Holt looked at Elias for 4 full seconds without speaking, the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to pick up or leave where it is. "I ask," he said, "because I've had concerns about archive integrity. Plates going missing. That kind of thing. Nothing has gone missing from this shop." "Not yet," Holt said. He reached for his hat, which he had apparently set on the corner of Greer's desk at some point, without Elias having seen him do it, and put it on with one unhurried motion. "I appreciate your thoroughness. It's a rare quality in this business." He walked past Elias to the stairs. The sound of his boots going down was slow and even and precisely as loud as it needed to be. The street door closed below them. Greer did not speak for a long moment. Then, "Elias, I need you to stop whatever it is you're doing." "I'm not doing anything." Greer looked at him with the expression of a man staring at a situation that has grown larger than the room available for it. He picked up a stack of manifests from his desk and turned toward his office without looking back. "I hope that's true," he said. The door closed behind him and Elias was alone in the outer office, with the flat December light through the window and the sound of the street below, and the specific weight of 2 words still sitting in the air between him and where Holt had been standing. Not yet. The phrase told him 2 things. First, Holt knew the notebook existed. Not where it was. If he had known that, the conversation would have had a different shape entirely. But he knew there was something. He had come to confirm it in Elias's face, and whatever he had seen in those 3 seconds at the foot of the stairwell had been enough. Second, Holt intended to move, and the timeline was short. The phrase "not yet" was not a threat made for tomorrow. It was a threat made for this week. He had perhaps 48 hours before Holt arrived at a decision. That afternoon, during the lunch hour, he went back into the files. Not for anomalies. He had enough anomalies. What he wanted was the origin, the first plate, the first submission, the moment the pattern had begun. He moved through the 1862 filing section until he found a manila envelope near the back, labeled with a company name he did not recognize. Consolidated Press Imagery, Baltimore, Maryland. 2 batches submitted before Holt's formal War Department press credentialing, processed under a subcontract arrangement that apparently predated Greer's current press agreements. He pulled the sleeves onto the examination table and brought the lamp close. 19 plates. October and December of 1862. He worked through them quickly, deliberate, systematic, tilting each one to the light in the sequence he had used for the August batch. The chemical smell in the room was sharper in the afternoon, the ether component rising as the temperature dropped with the failing light outside. He had perhaps 10 minutes before Greer returned from lunch. By the time he reached the 7th plate, he had found the fence post section, the same stripped bark upper end he had cataloged in the September 1864 batch, appearing here in an image labeled Maryland Campaign, September 1862. By the 12th plate, he had a rain versus drought inconsistency identical in kind to the one in plate 9. And then in the very first plate from October 1862, the earliest image Garfield Holt had ever submitted to this shop, he found the artillery limber, whole, both wheels intact, positioned in the right foreground of a scene labeled Antietam Sector, September 17th, 1862. The same limber, 2 years before it appeared in the June 1864 Cold Harbor plate. Its right wheel undamaged, the spoke that would eventually shatter into 9 fragments still intact, still early in its life as a prop. He looked at it for 30 seconds, the specific duration he permitted himself, and then put every sleeve back in the envelope in the correct order, and returned the envelope to the exact position he had found it. He pressed the drawer closed. He stood at the filing cabinet with his hand still on the handle, and did arithmetic he had not wanted to do. If the practice extended from October 1862 through September 1864, 24 months, and if Holt had submitted 1 batch every 6 to 8 weeks over that period, the total number of affected plates was not 26. It was not even 40. It was closer to 60, possibly 70. 2 years of staged imagery moving through the American press, published in the pages of the 2 most widely circulated illustrated newspapers in the North, seen by an estimated readership of more than 2 million people per issue, who had been consuming these photographs as authentic documentation of a war in which their sons and brothers and husbands were actually dying at a rate of 300 men per day along some sectors of the Virginia front. 60 plates. He went back to the development room. He put his hands in the bath. He worked through the afternoon in the amber-lit silence and thought about what 60 fraudulent photographs meant. Not just about Holt's career, but about every editor who had printed them and called them true. every government official who had approved his credentials and escorted him through the lines, every family that had wept over an image of a battlefield that had been assembled in an open field somewhere in Maryland on a Thursday afternoon with a borrowed wagon and a broken prop, and the dead sourced from wherever a man with the right papers could find them. The war was real. The dead were entirely real. The photographs were theater, made for an audience that had never been asked whether it consented to being shown a performance instead of a fact. Nobody had been looking. Nobody except him. He needed a witness, not a journalist, not a government clerk. Those channels were closed. What he needed was a man who had been physically present at one of the engagement sites Holt's plates claimed to document. A man who could say from his own body's experience of the ground that the terrain in the image was wrong, that the tree line was not where the photograph placed it, that the field was swamp, not open land, that the sun did not fall the way the shadow said it did at that hour in that place. He found his candidate through a Union veterans discharge office on 14th Street, a man named James Prentice, 33 years old, formerly a private in the Ninth Corps, discharged in August 1864 after a leg wound sustained during the Weldon Railroad operations. Prentice loaded freight at a dry goods warehouse on Indiana Avenue. He was a compact, dark-haired man with the careful movements of someone who had spent 4 months relearning how to walk on a mended leg. He did not look at Elias with particular curiosity when Elias appeared at the warehouse door on a Thursday afternoon. He looked at the sketch, a hand-drawn reproduction of the compositional details from Plate 4, the tree line angle and the railroad grade and the shadow direction, with the focused attention of a man reading something in a language he had hoped never to read again. He was quiet for a long time. The warehouse smelled of sawdust and coal and tallow. Somewhere in the back, someone was moving crates. The tree cover was northeast, Prentice said finally, not looking up from the sketch. Northeast of the grade. Where you've drawn it, that's southwest. That's open farmland. I crossed that ground myself on August 20th. There wasn't a tree within half a mile of where this photographer claims he was standing. He touched the sketch with one index finger, not pressing it, just touching it the way you touch something you want to understand without disturbing it. Whoever took this wasn't there, he said quietly. Would you be willing to say that in writing? Elias asked. The change in Prentice's face was not anger and not fear. It was something more weary than either. The expression of a man who has understood the shape of a thing before he has heard all the words. He handed the sketch back without looking at Elias. He said he had a wife expecting their first child in February. He said he had this job in his room, and both of those things required him to have no difficulty with anyone connected to the army or the press. He said it without bitterness. He said it with the finality of a man who had made the calculation completely and arrived at the only answer that kept his life intact. Elias thanked him and folded the sketch and walked back north through the December dusk and did not permit himself to call Prentice's answer anything other than what it was. The only reasonable response available to a man with modest circumstances and no institutional armor, being asked to walk into the open against a photographer with a senator and a White House acquaintance. The second attempt came 4 days later, and it came closer. A smaller processing shop on F Street, Whitmore's portrait work and occasional press commissions, employed a darkroom assistant named Becker, a German immigrant who had worked previously for a press photography agency in Cincinnati. Elias had heard, through the loose, informal circuit of processing workers who occasionally crossed paths at chemical supply houses, that Becker had spoken more than once about inconsistencies he had noticed in battlefield photographs at his Cincinnati employer, and had been told to stop noticing them. Elias went to Whitmore's on a Saturday morning, introduced himself, and spent 10 professional minutes discussing silver nitrate sourcing before asking carefully whether Becker had ever encountered anomalies in campaign photograph documentation. Becker looked at him for a moment. Then he reached under the preparation counter and brought out a small tin box that had originally held photographic chemical tablets. He set it on the counter. He opened it. Inside were 11 pieces of paper, folded small. Notes, Elias could see, written in German in a small, careful hand. Becker took them out and spread 3 of them flat on the counter between them, and Elias saw immediately that they were the same kind of record he had been keeping. Shadow angle observations, moisture inconsistencies, a note about a prop, a cavalry saddle appearing in 2 images from different states, the same split leather at the pommel, the same repair stitching. Becker had been watching the same thing in a different city, for a different photographer, and he had been keeping notes about it for over a year. He looked at the notes on the counter for 4 seconds. Then he picked them up, folded them back to their original creases, and put them in the tin. He put the tin back under the counter. He turned back to the preparation vessel he had been working with when Elias arrived and picked up his measuring glass. "I have a life here," he said. "Small, careful. I've worked very hard to make it that way." He did not say anything else. He poured the measure. He did not look up again. Elias left the shop and stood on F Street in the December cold for a moment. The sound of the street around him, the smell of coal smoke in the air. Becker had been taking the same measurements. Becker had the same notes. And Becker had stopped himself at the moment of stopped himself by putting 11 pieces of paper back in a tin and closing the lid, which meant Becker had already made this calculation before today and had already arrived at his answer. The difference between today and any other day was only that Elias had been there to watch him do it. 2 men, the right knowledge, the same wall. He was not angry. He walked north on F Street and understood, with a new and specific clarity, that he could not ask anyone to carry this with him. The cost was too visible, and the protection too theoretical, and the outcome too uncertain for any man with something to lose to make a different choice than the one Prentice and Becker had made. He was on his own, and he had been on his own since August, and the only thing that had changed between August and December was that the people he was trying to expose had now confirmed, through Holt's visit and Greer's face and 2 words said on a staircase, that they were aware of his existence. He was not running low on time. He was out of it. He had been wrong about the 48 hours. Holt moved in 7 days, not 2. Elias returned to his room on G Street at 6:20 on the evening of the 7th day after the shop visit. He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, unlocked the door with the key on the cord inside his coat, and stood at the entrance the way he had developed the habit of standing, completely still, looking at the room before stepping into it, reading the surface of things the way he read a photographic plate. The chair was 2 inches further from the table than he kept it. He stood in the doorway and breathed once, and looked at everything else. The wash basin on the stand near the window had been moved 3 inches left and replaced to approximately its original position. The displacement visible in a faint ring of water below the left edge, where the base had sat for 2 months on the same spot. The pocket almanacs on the shelf above the basin were in the correct order but reversed, spines facing in rather than out. Someone had lifted them to check behind them and had not noticed which direction they faced. Every surface had been examined. Someone had spent at least 30 minutes in this room, working with care, looking for something they knew how to look for. He crossed to the corner where the broken camera case sat. He did not move quickly. He crossed the room at an ordinary pace, set his coat on the chair, and crouched in front of the case with both hands on the floor beside it, looking at it before he touched it. The sprung latch was in its usual position. The lid angled up the same 3/4 inch it always maintained, because the hinge spring had given out 18 months ago. Nothing had been moved. It looked exactly as it had always looked, like a piece of equipment with no remaining function, left in a corner by a man too disorganized to dispose of it. He pressed the lid down. He opened it. The notebook was there, oilcloth intact. The contact print of plate 16 still glued inside the back cover. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been found, because the people who had searched his room were looking for a hidden object, something deliberately concealed, and the camera case was not hidden. It was simply broken. It was the kind of unremarkable clutter that accumulates in a working man's rented room and which no one who is looking for something important thinks to examine. For 30 seconds he did not move. He stayed crouched beside the case with one hand pressed on the lid and understood 2 things simultaneously, the way understanding sometimes arrives in pairs. The first, the notebook was safe for now, because the one piece of luck available to him had been that the people searching this room were looking for something that looked like evidence, and evidence looks like something deliberate. The second, they would be back. The search had not been an endpoint. It was a message, delivered through a moved chair and reversed almanac spines so that he would know they had been there without their having left anything a constable could name as trespass. They would return when they had decided that the message had reached him and that he had not acted on it. He had perhaps 4 days, possibly 3. He stood up. He went to the window. December fog softening the gas lamps below. The street empty, except for a delivery wagon moving south toward the mall. He could hear a military band somewhere north, the brass carrying thin and clear through the cold, the way sound carries when the air is wet and the streets are quiet. He pulled the notebook from the case and opened it, not to his evidence entries, but to a blank page near the middle, as far from the contact print as he could get, and wrote one name he had spent 3 weeks refusing to write, because writing it made the thing it represented real. Aldrich, the War Department clerk. The man who had told him, in the filing room on a Wednesday afternoon in November, that photographic records were maintained for historical preservation, not verification. The man who visited Greer's shop every week and removed archive materials and brought them to a building on 17th Street where people whose names did not appear in newspapers made decisions about what the American press was permitted to contain. Elias worked backward from what he knew. The weather telegraph logs, The documents that had allowed him to prove Plate 9's moisture inconsistency came from a War Department file that Aldrich personally collected and distributed. Aldrich handled those logs weekly. He would have seen the same discrepancy that Elias had seen the first time he pulled the file. He would have seen it in August or September, or at any point in the 2 years he had been walking through Greer's shop and removing materials and cross-referencing them against government records. And he had said nothing. Not to the press, not to Greer, not to any editorial board. He had said nothing because he already knew, which meant he had known before Elias's investigation had begun, which meant the suppression did not originate with Holt protecting his reputation. It originated somewhere above Holt, in a building on 17th Street. In a chain of decisions made by people whose names did not appear in newspapers about what 2 million readers of illustrated weeklies needed to believe about a war that was still killing 300 men per day along the Petersburg front. Holt was not the problem. Holt was the instrument. Elias closed the notebook and held it in both hands in the cold of his room and sat with the full weight of that understanding. He had spent 4 months treating this as a question of photographic fraud. A famous photographer, a credulous press, a darkroom worker with precise eyes and 47 pages of documented evidence. He had been wrong about the frame entirely. The frame was larger than one man's reputation. The frame was the government of the United States deciding, in the 4th year of a war, it was not permitted to lose politically what its citizens were allowed to see. 3 days to Friday, he wrapped the notebook in its oilcloth. He put it back in the camera case and pressed the lid down and left it in the corner where it had always sat. Then he put on his coat and his hat and went out into the December fog. He knew where he was going. It had taken him 4 months to arrive at the only answer that made sense. There was a printer on Q Street named Cornelius Webb, an old man now, 62, mostly retired, who had set type for 3 abolitionist newspapers in the 1840s and 1850s, and who had once, in 1856, published a single issue of a broadsheet exposing a federal land survey fraud before the plates were confiscated by a U.S. Marshal and the office sealed. Webb had survived it. He had kept his composure and his silence and his press, and 8 years later he was still there, on Q Street, operating a small job printing business for church programs and trade circulars, and he was the one man in Washington, D.C., who Elias Croom was reasonably certain had already asked himself, more than once in his life, whether a black man's 47 pages of careful evidence was the same thing as evidence. Webb was the card, the only one left. He walked north through the fog toward Q Street, the gas lamps haloed in the December wet, and thought about his father standing over a proof sheet in a kitchen in Philadelphia, pressing it flat with his palm, saying, "Light on silver. That's a different kind of witness." He had the witness. He needed one more thing. He needed someone to print it. Cornelius Webb answered the door on the second knock. He was 62 years old, smaller than Elias had expected. A narrow-shouldered man in a printer's apron with ink-dark hands, and the unhurried, assessing eyes of someone who had spent 40 years deciding at the door whether the person standing in front of him was worth letting in. He looked at Elias. He looked at the December fog behind him. He stepped back and held the door open, and Elias came in out of the cold into the smell of oil ink and cedar and the deep, particular warmth of a room that had a working press in it. The shop was 2 rooms. The front held a wooden jobbing press, a compositing stand, a rack of type cases, and a work table covered in proof sheets for what appeared to be a church choir directory. A single oil lamp hung from the ceiling, its flame burning perfectly still in the absence of any draft. Webb did not offer to take Elias's coat. He sat down on a stool beside the compositing stand and folded his hands in his lap and said, "Tell me what you have." Elias told him. He spoke for 22 minutes without interruption, laying out the evidence in the same logical sequence he had used with Greer in September. Shadow angles, weather log discrepancies, prop duplication, the arithmetic. But this time he went further. The 1862 connection, the credentialing arrangement, the artillery limber in the October 1862 Antietam plate, and the same limber in the June 1864 Cold Harbor plate, and the same limber again in September 1864 at Sutherland Station. 38 miles apart, 14 months apart, the same 9 fragment spoke, the same camera angle relative to the wheel, Aldrich. What Aldrich's foreknowledge implied about where the suppression had originated and who had authorized it. Webb listened to all of it without moving. When Elias finished, he was quiet for a long time. "How many copies of this evidence exist?" he said. "1," Elias said. "The notebook and 1 contact print, glued inside the back cover." Webb looked at the lamp for a moment, then he said, "That is the problem. When a man has 1 copy of a dangerous document, the document is not safe. It is 1 fire, 1 theft, 1 flood from having never existed at all. What you have built is real, but real is not the same as surviving." He stood and went to the type case and stood looking at it with his back to Elias. "Come back tomorrow night," he said, "after 9. Bring the notebook." Elias did not sleep that night. He lay in his room on G Street and stared at the ceiling and made himself work through the decision methodically. Whether Webb was safe, whether bringing the notebook to a print shop on Q Street was a smaller risk than leaving it in a broken camera case in a room that had already been searched once. He went through it slowly, the way he measured chemical ratios for a development tray. When he reached the end of the calculation, the answer was what it had been at the beginning. He had no other move. He arrived at Webb's shop at 9:15 the following evening. Webb was alone. He had cleared the work table and set up a contact printing frame, a sheet of unexposed paper pressed against a glass plate under a lamp, producing a direct contact print of whatever the plate contained. He had sourced unexposed contact paper from somewhere he did not explain and Elias did not ask about. He read the notebook entries for 30 minutes in complete silence. He asked 6 clarifying questions, all specific, all technical, none the kind of question a man asks when he doubts what he is being told. Then he sat down at the compositing stand and began setting type. What Webb produced over the 3 nights that followed was not an accusation. It could not be. Elias had understood from their first conversation that naming Holt directly, this specific photographer staged these specific images, published under any legible address, would be seized inside a week. Webb had survived the 1856 broadside confiscation because he had understood something specific about how suppression moved. It went toward the particular and left the general alone. What he printed now was a technical document, a single broadsheet, attributed to no one, describing precisely how wet plate collodion photography could be used to construct staged battlefield scenes. The specific techniques available to a photographer with a wagon and adequate resources. The specific photographic signatures that staging produced. Shadow angle differential, prop duplication detection, moisture inconsistency analysis, contact print comparison across archive batches. Every detail was accurate. Every observation was reproducible by anyone with the relevant plates and the knowledge to look. No photographer named, no publication named, no engagement named. Any photographer, editor, or darkroom worker in the country who read it would know immediately what it described. Webb set the type by hand, letter by letter, in 14-point Caslon. He corrected the proof twice. On the third night, he ran the press, the hand lever moving at the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. The smell of fresh ink thick in the small, warm room, each impression clean and even. When he finished, 47 copies sat in a stack beside the press, each sheet slightly warm from the pressure of the platen. He handed the stack to Elias to count. 47. He took it back and counted again himself. 47. "I'll keep 8, he said. "You take 4. The rest go through the network." The network was what remained, in December of 1864, of the abolitionist press distribution system that had moved pamphlets and broadsides through church basements and Freedmen's Aid reading rooms from Washington to Philadelphia to Boston for 30 years. It was slower than it had been in the 1840s, quieter, reduced by attrition, legal pressure, and the reorganization that war forces on everything. But it still functioned. It still moved paper. Over the following 3 weeks, 31 copies reached their destinations. 7 printing houses in 3 states, 4 Freedmen's Aid reading rooms, 2 newspaper offices, and 11 private individuals whose names Webb kept in a locked composition book Elias never saw the inside of. Each copy arrived folded inside a church circular or a trade directory. The outer wrapper bearing a return address from a commercial stationer on Rhode Island Avenue that had closed in November and whose mail was being forwarded nowhere. 16 copies never arrived. They were intercepted. By what mechanism Elias never learned precisely, though the most probable explanation was that the War Department's Communication Review Office had flagged Webb's wrapper style from the 1856 incident and kept it on a watch list that had never formally expired. 16 copies. Gone. 31 survived. On the 14th of January, 1865, Harlan Greer called Elias into the outer office at the start of the morning shift. He spoke with genuine discomfort, visible in every part of his face. The press contracts had been reduced. The position was being eliminated as part of a staff reduction. Elias would be paid through the end of the month. The position would not be refilled. Elias asked whether this was connected to his examination of the archive materials. Greer said it was not. He said it looking at a point roughly 4 inches to the left of Elias's face. That was always the direction Harlan Greer's eyes moved, when the lie was significant enough to require the full effort of maintaining it. Elias collected the 2 personal items from the development room: his chemical timing notebook, which was not the notebook, and a photographic chemistry reference text, and left Pennsylvania Avenue for the last time. He walked south into the January cold, turned at the corner, and kept walking past G Street, south toward the river, where the wind came in hard off the Potomac, and the sound of the city fell back behind him. He stood at the edge of the wharf for perhaps 10 minutes, watching the gray water move. Then he walked to Q Street and knocked twice. Webb already knew. He had heard that morning through a contact he did not name. "It's done then," Elias said. "For now," Webb said. "Things that are done are not always finished." He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove. The first time he had offered Elias anything in 3 weeks of late-night work together, and set one across the table. They sat in the warm, ink-smelling room. The press stood still in the corner. Outside, January moved along Q Street slowly, the way January does. They did not speak for a while. That was enough. What followed was slow and, in its particular way, complete. Garfield Holt submitted no further photographs to any illustrated publication after March of 1865. His retirement notice appeared in the New York Illustrated News that April. 3 paragraphs attributing his withdrawal to declining health and the rigors of 4 years of field documentation. He was 52 years old. He retired to a property in upstate New York. He died there in 1889, 24 years after the last plate he submitted, having never again applied for press credentials or operated a mobile darkroom. His work remained in the archives of Harper's Weekly and 5 other publications, cited and reprinted as authentic documentation of the Civil War's human cost for decades after his death. In October of 1865, a War Department administrative order classified Holt's entire submitted plate archive, 31 separate batches, March 1863 through September 1864, as restricted historical materials, pending future review. The order was signed by a senior administrator whose name appears on 14 similar orders from the same period, each one sealing a wartime press photography archive. The word review appears in all 14. Not one of the 14 archives was ever formally reviewed. Not one. Aldrich continued at the War Department until 1877. His retirement file, located in 1989 by a researcher going through Reconstruction-era personnel records, lists his service as General Records Maintenance. It makes no mention of Photographic Archive Administration. His name does not appear in any history of Civil War press photography published before 1990. Cornelius Webb ran his shop on Q Street until 1871. Church directories, trade circulars, nothing more controversial than a Methodist communion schedule. He died in 1878. The composition book with the distribution list was never found. 8 copies of the 47-sheet broadside had been kept in a false bottom Webb had built into a type case in 1849 for a different kind of emergency. His nephew found them during the 1879 liquidation sale, did not understand what they were, and sold them with the remaining type stock to a job printer in Georgetown who used the blank sides for proof sheets. 7 were destroyed. 1 survived because the proofer had pulled a test impression from it by accident, read the first paragraph, and set it in a drawer marked miscellaneous rather than the waste bin. That copy passed through 4 hands between 1879 and 1921. A woman donated it to a small archive that year, with a note saying only that it was old and seemed important. She was correct. Elias Croom returned to Philadelphia in the spring of 1866. He found work at a printing house on Vine Street. cylinder press, trade publications, business correspondence. 19 years of that work. He married in 1868, 3 children. He was precise, reliable, trusted with the machinery, never promoted to a supervisory position, which was not unusual for a black man in commercial printing in Philadelphia in the 1870s and 1880s. He died in February 1891, 55 years old, from pneumonia contracted during a cold January. His death received 3 lines in a church newsletter. He left his wife a modest estate. Among the items listed, 1 broken wooden camera case with a sprung latch. His wife, Adeline, kept the case. She did not know what was inside it. She moved twice after his death, and each time the case moved with her, not because she had examined it, but because it had been his, and she kept the things that had been his with the careful attention of a woman who understands that objects outlast memory and that memory outlasts nearly everything else. When Adeline died in 1919, the case passed to her youngest daughter. From that daughter to her own daughter. By 1942, it sat in the attic of a house in North Philadelphia belonging to a woman named Ruth Croom Howard, Elias's granddaughter, who had never heard the name Garfield Holt. In the autumn of 1942, Ruth was clearing the attic to rent the house. Her husband was in the Pacific. She needed the income. When she came across the broken camera case and opened it, the latch gave way immediately. It had not properly closed in decades. Inside the oilcloth was a cloth-bound notebook. She lifted it out and held it in the thin autumn light that came through the attic's single small window. And what she noticed first was the smell, not of the attic, not of dust, but of something older and chemical under the fabric, the ghost of a darkroom that had been sealed in oilcloth for 50 years. She opened the cover. 47 pages of careful handwriting, solar angle calculations in the margins, plate numbers, dates, cross-references, 6 clarifying questions answered in footnotes, and glued inside the back cover, a contact print the size of a playing card, an artillery wheel with 9 shattered spokes, slightly faded, entirely legible. Ruth Croom Howard was a school teacher. She was methodical about things she did not understand. She read every page of the notebook before she made any decision about it. It took 4 evenings. She mailed it to Howard University, addressed care of the history department, with a 2-page letter explaining what she believed it contained. She included her return address. The university acknowledged receipt 4 months later with a printed form letter. The notebook remained in a departmental file for 26 years. In 1968, a graduate student named David Croom, Ruth's son, Elias's great-grandson, enrolled in Howard University's history program. In his second year, working in the departmental files on a thesis about Civil War photography in the Virginia campaigns, he found the notebook in a manila folder. He recognized the family name on the cover. He read it in a single sitting. He spent the following 14 months cross-referencing Elias's entries against the glass plate holdings at the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division, which included a substantial portion of Holt's submitted work, donated by the Holt estate in 1921. The thesis David Croom produced was 93 pages long. It reconstructed the full analysis, verified 28 of the 32 documented anomalies against the surviving plates, and established beyond reasonable question that at least 19 of Holt's published battlefield images had been staged or substantially misrepresented in their captioning. The History Department committee accepted it in the spring of 1970. The external reviewer's report praised the methodology and recommended wider archival distribution. The thesis was not published commercially. It was not covered in any newspaper. The external reviewer's report was filed with the thesis and remained unread by anyone outside Howard University for the next 30 years. In 1973, a photography historian named Rudolf Falk, working independently in Berlin, published a 4-page technical note in a German-language journal observing prop duplication and shadow inconsistencies in a selection of American Civil War photographs from multiple archives. He did not cite the Croom thesis. He had not read it. He had found his way to the same conclusions through the same methodology, on his own, without knowing that Elias Croom had arrived at exactly those conclusions 108 years earlier. While his hands were in a sodium thiosulfate bath on Pennsylvania Avenue, and the December light outside the window of Greer's shop had barely begun to change. The same eyes, the same glass, a century apart. In 2003, the Library of Congress launched a large-scale digitization initiative, making approximately 1.1 million photographs searchable online. Among the materials digitized were 63 glass plate holdings attributed to Garfield Holt, including the October 1862 Antietam sector image and the June 1864 Cold Harbor image and the September 1864 Sutherland Station image. Within 8 months, 4 independent researchers in 3 countries had posted online comparisons of the artillery limber, appearing in all 3. A photography forum thread from November 2003, 47 messages long, traced the wheel through the images, noted the 9-fragment damage pattern, and calculated the geographic impossibility of its presence in both the 1862 and 1864 locations. The thread reached the same conclusion Elias Croom had reached in September of 1864. It was cited in a magazine article in 2005, in a university course syllabus in 2009, and in a documentary film about Civil War photography in 2014. The film did not mention Elias Croom. He was not an unknown figure by then. The Croom thesis had by 2014 been digitized and cataloged and cited in 3 academic articles. But his name had not crossed from the academic record into public circulation. That crossing happened in 2019, when a long-form historical article traced the online thread back through the Falk note and the Croom thesis, and the Howard University departmental file, and Ruth's 2-page covering letter, and the attic on North Philadelphia, and the oilcloth wrapper, and the broken camera case, all the way to a room on G Street in Washington, D.C., in December 1864, to a man standing at his window in the fog, deciding whether to trust a printer on Q Street with the only copy of 47 pages that the most powerful photographic institution in America had spent 6 months trying to locate. The article included a reproduction of the contact print from the inside back cover. The artillery limber, the 9-fragment spoke, playing card size. Kept by 3 women across 78 years through 2 world wars and 4 house moves, and 1 husband who died at 55 without ever explaining what was in the case he asked her to keep. The notebook is currently held at Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Research Center. It is available for examination by appointment. The oilcloth is disintegrating at the edges. The handwriting is entirely legible. Elias Croom, never got his door opened. He tried 4 times. Greer, Aldrich, Prentice, the burned letter, and found the same wall each time. He was a black man in 1864 Washington with 47 pages of careful evidence and no institution willing to receive it as such. He lost his job. He was not reinstated. He was not compensated. His name appears in no account of Civil War photography before 2019. Garfield Holt's images circulated as authentic historical documentation for more than a century after Elias had documented their construction, measured their anomalies, and hidden the record of his findings in a camera case too broken to attract attention. But he wrapped the notebook in oilcloth and pressed the lid down. He had understood something the people who searched his room and sealed the archive and retired to upstate New York had not fully worked out. Suppression works on the present. It does not work on glass. A plate, properly fixed and stored, does not change. The shadow angle in plate 4 in 1864 is the same shadow angle in plate 4 in 2003. The artillery limber with the 9-fragment spoke does not travel between the October 1862 plate and the September 1864 plate because it is fixed in silver, and silver does not revise its testimony under pressure. His father had told him this. He had not forgotten. Images are the only testimony a court cannot suppress. Words can be called lies. Numbers can be called mistakes. But light on silver, that's a different kind of witness. The witness waited. It waited in a government archive for 56 years. It waited in the Library of Congress for 82 more. It waited in a departmental file at Howard University for 26, and in an attic in North Philadelphia for 23 before that, and in a broken camera case on G Street for 25 years before Elias died and left it to a woman who had never heard the name Garfield Holt, but understood, without being able to say why, that the thing her husband had carried for 25 years in an inside coat pocket was worth keeping. There is only one question worth asking about all of it. Not who arranged this, not who sealed the archive, not who signed the administrative order, but how long the people who did those things believed it would hold. How long a suppression can remain a suppression when the thing being suppressed is made of light, fixed in silver, stored in a climate-controlled room at the Library of Congress, where it can be examined by anyone with the patience to look. The glass remembered. It always had. It was waiting for someone who knew how to read it.